Welcome, everyone. It's good to see all you friends back. My name is Tom Schmidt. This is the Revelation Reception Network. We are an international scholarly network that focuses on the historical and contemporary reception of John's revelation. This network was founded to create and maintain an open and welcoming environment in which scholars collaborate, share ideas, communicate with new literature and projects, stay current with conferences, and so forth. And all relevant languages, all research topics and methodologies, time periods, and so forth are welcome. Today, I am delighted to say that we have two wonderful book reviews. One is on Martina Vercesi's book, Revelation 19 through 21 in the Exegesis of Early Christian Roman Africa by Mohr Siebeck, published this year. The second is by Nathan Betz, City of the Gods, the New Jerusalem of John's Revelation in Early Christianity, published with Brill. The format we'll be following is we will have a reviewer who I will introduce. They'll go for about 15 or so minutes. Then we'll have the second reviewer on the second book, and then we'll also have a 5-minute response for each author after the review, and then we'll have time for questions at the end, probably about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So we'll go 15-minute response or 15-minute review, 5-minute response, and then 15-minute review, 5 or so minute response. Nathan, did I get that format right? I think I did, but chime in if
Yeah,
I'm
I think it did. We're a very forgiving group of people, I think.
wonderful. Good. So let me begin by introducing Martina Vercesi. As I mentioned, uh, her book is entitled Revelation 19 through 21 in the Exegesis of Early Christian Roman Africa, published with Mohr Siebeck this year. Martina earned her degree in classics from the University of Milan, where she began working on textual criticism and the Synoptic Gospels. She pursued her PhD from the University of St. Andrews under Mark Elliott, where she concentrated on Revelation chapters 19 through 21 in the context of ancient North African Christian communities. Currently, Martina is a research associate at the Research Unit for Biblical Studies of KU Leuven's Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. She's also a member of the Multilingual Manuscript Research Center. She's part of the ERC Bicross project, which looks at bilingual manuscripts. And she's currently studying the bilingual Greek and Latin New Testament with a particular focus on Western readings. Her book will be reviewed by our good friend Nathan Betz. And Nathan's book is also being reviewed, but I'll introduce him now. Nathan is postdoc research fellow and entrepreneur at the University of Regensburg. He holds a DFG Eigene Stelle Fellowship, and he explores the late antique reception of the idea of the New Jerusalem from John's Revelation in early literature and art, Greek, Latin, and Syriac. He writes on Christian mysticism, deification, and teleology. And just to keep life exciting, he's also launching an academic startup called Civilizational Investment, which is a distributed initiative that focuses on discovering, digitizing, and popularizing neglected or at-risk pre-modern texts. Please join me in welcoming Martina and Nathan.
All right. So it's a great privilege and a pleasure to get to review your book, Martina. For everyone else, Martina and I were actually working on our dissertations at the same time, and we discovered that we were working on overlapping material in an overlapping period, and just taking fairly different methodologies at looking at similar materials. So it's really exciting to get to critically engage with the book of the person that I was talking with during the pandemic about all of this stuff. Despite being on good terms with Martina, I will nevertheless endeavor to provide a fair critique of this book. And so off we go. Um, so Vercesi's, or I'll just say Martina's book. We're amongst friends here. Um, Martina's book, which is the published development of her St. Andrew's dissertation, is an in-depth critical study of the reception, use, and interpretation of Revelation chapters 19 through 21 in early Christian North Africa. covering ancient texts in multiple genres, including treatises, letters, scriptural commentary, and especially martyrdom literature, and mostly in Latin, from the beginning of the use of Latin as a Christian literary language until the end of the 4th century, that is, until just before Augustine. She begins the book with a fabulously and perhaps counterintuitively perceptive quote from Charles Hill on the ancient Christian use of revelation. She quotes Hill as saying, "Naturally, revelation played a formative role in the development of Christian eschatological thought, though the reading of Revelation was never confined to eschatological interests in the usual sense of the term. Christians always found the book to be full of ethical and Christological insight that informed the present life of churches and the discipleship of individuals." This point in many respects captures Martina's entire book, which never loses sight of the diverse theological and historical richness of these apparently explicitly eschatological passages. After all, as she confirms, chapter 9 in the early North African reception is largely about Christ's parousia. Chapter 20 is largely about the millennial kingdom of Christ. And chapter 21 is mostly about the New Jerusalem, all traditionally eschatological topics. Throughout her study, however, she demonstrates time and again the extent to which these ideas were often associated more with this worldly, here and now concerns with North African Christians as they carried out their lives and worship in a world frequently marked by persecution and the effects of church discipline, church factionalism, and broader intellectual and cultural currents. I have to look up occasionally because I realize I'm the only admin on this call and I need to let in other guests. The book picks up and develops several recent trends, including North African Christianity, martyrdom and its theology, and societal impact of biblical reception. At the same time, she identifies and fills several lacunae, which include especially the dearth of scholarship on the early exegesis of Revelation, especially in the western part of the Roman Empire, and the relative invisibility of modern Italian or at least neglect of modern Italian scholarship on all these topics to much of the Anglophone world. Methodologically, she works her way chronologically through the literary record, visiting not only early theological treatises and theological reflection, but also an oft-neglected source for biblical exegesis, local martyrdom accounts. As she progresses through the book, she also keeps track of text-critical issues that throw light on the difficult task of reconstructing the text of Revelation, especially in its Latin forms. Simplifying Carol D. Osborne's citation taxonomy in methodology in identifying patristic citations and New Testament textual criticism authors, Vercesi employs two overarching categories to encompass the citations. She uses citations, which are direct, verbatim quotations on the one hand, and allusion, which are more subtle but still detectable uses of the text on the other. The introduction also backdrops the entire study with coverage of the context and content of Revelation 19 through 21 as a text in itself. This through the lens of modern scholarship and exegesis, while also discussing the special place that Revelation had amongst North African Christians. Each of the subsequent chapters consists of sections devoted to each author or text under investigation. First, and this is kind of the paradigm that she follows throughout all of the central chapters of her book. First, she begins with a background where she sketches a biography and or context of the author or text in question, often surfacing key themes and ideas to be found in them, pointing out how these themes compare with other relevant authors and texts and what sort of text of Revelation they were using. Second, She moves to a narrow analysis of the use of all citations of and possible allusions to Revelation 19 through 21 in each work or in each author, at the same time drawing out what must have been an immense amount of research into the relevant secondary literature to elucidate not only the text, but also the historical context, theological content, and philological and text critical issues. And she does this in English, in Italian, in French, and in German. It's really quite an amazing bibliography. While not restricted to it, this analysis often surfaces thematic material that occurs in other featured texts as well, kind of cross-references throughout the texts. And in this way, we are treated to frequent moments of focus on topics such as martyrdom, which is perhaps the most consistent of all motifs throughout the books, but also the church, millennialism in both its more and less literal forms, the cosmic or world week schema, especially its sixth and seventh weeks, the desire for justice amid persecution, eschatological chronology, and the resurrection, one or both of them, depending on how you read Revelation, and the timing of all these eschatological events. Christ's second advent, the final judgment with its ensuing rewards and punishment, and then, of course, all the thematic, hermeneutical, and doctrinal idiosyncrasies that occur in a lot of these texts. Most sections conclude by highlighting key takeaways for each author or text. So using kind of this framework, she works through chronologically through the North African texts before her, which seems to me more or less exhaustive of the texts that occur up until Augustine. So in chapter 2, Vercesi visits the usage of Revelation 19 through 20 in the earliest Christian North African Latin document, the Acta Martyrum Scilitanorum and Tertullian's corpus. Revelation is, for both, an important part of eschatological thinking in that it emphasizes the importance of believers' faith in Christ's return, the hope of justice in the millennial kingdom. The third chapter also groups a martyr account, the Passio Perpetuae, with the more theological and pastoral work of Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, as well as the pseudo-Cyprianic writings. All texts produced more or less during severely difficult seasons of the North African Church, due variously to persecution, famine, faction, and imperial political considerations. The Passio Perpetuae stresses the role of Revelation 19 through 21 in underscoring the continuity between Christians' experience on the earth, on the one hand, and their destiny and the destiny of the world, eschatologically, not least in its use of the New Jerusalem figure. As for Cyprian, both millennialist and anti-millennialist tendencies, as perceived and debated today, are scrutinized within his corpus, as well as his belief that all faithful believers, not only the martyrs, are eligible for the kingdom of God. Also observed is his belief that the life of prayer foreshadows one's future in the New Jerusalem. The De Montibus Sina et Sinai, one of the pseudo-Cyprianic works. In this work, Vercesi proposes a possibly millennialistic text. I'm not sure that's the case, but anyway, this is a respectable position. But nevertheless, she does observe its spiritualizing and ecclesializing tendencies, especially in its crucifixion-oriented interpretation of the coming New Jerusalem. The texts are also observed to stress the believers reigning with God according to Revelation 20, verse 6. The fourth chapter proceeds to mid and late 3rd century Commodian and Lactantius, who in their Roman imperial context heavily employed Jewish apocalyptic and classical traditions respectively. Lactantius's aim in using Revelation, which is structurally indispensable for his eschatology in the Divinae Institutiones, is largely apologetic and aimed at a pagan audience unlikely to be convinced by citations of Christian scripture. The saint's eschatological function of ruling and judging with God is underscored, as well as their transformation to approximate angels. The Latin Commodianus, Vercesi sets in the 3rd century, as opposed to the 5th or 6th, as others do, and she observes how both he and Lactantius uniquely consider the millennium and the New Jerusalem to be contemporaneous. While adapting its eschatological timeline to their uses, neither of these authors seems to refer to Revelation by name, which is an interesting pattern that recurs also in the Greek tradition sometimes, and Syriac. In the 5th chapter, Vercesi excavates early Donatist documents, that is, documents stemming from the rigorous Christian critiques of what they saw as the worldly church that was capitulating to secularizing and compromising tendencies amid imperial persecution. This documentation is mainly martyrological, and it shows how the Donatists endured under long-term intramural Christian persecution on the one hand, and indeed external non-Christian persecution on the other hand. Their perspective, the Donatist perspective, is mainly eschatological, but also focuses on how the church itself was subject to diabolical influences from within and would one day undergo divine judgment. In this chapter, Vercesi continues to develop the connection between martyrdom and revelation, drawing especially on the work of Saxer and Middleton to elucidate the theme of martyrdom in Revelation that would prove so potent to the North African churches in these centuries. She develops and kind of has a section of reflection on the connection between martyrdom in the text of Revelation itself and how it's developed in some of these Donatist martyrdom texts. In chapter 6, which is in many senses the most interesting chapter I've found, considers at length the great Donatist theologian and exegete Tychonius, with his time-bending and subsequently highly influential approach to Revelation, and after him, the late millennialist Valerianus. In the final chapter, we find Vercesi's conclusions. She observes first that revelation is present early and often in the early North African literature, and that its use exemplifies and exposes the exegetical habits, compositional practices of martyrological literature, and the significant textual readings in the Latin tradition. Further, Revelation was uniquely authoritative, and she points out that Revelation was uniquely authoritative in this region and was used broadly throughout the region to encourage Christians under persecution to endure martyrdom faithfully. And it was often used in conjunction also with non-Christian texts, such as classical in the case of Lactantius and Jewish apocalyptic in the case of Commodianus. And she reveals important previously inadequately appreciated motifs, references, and hermeneutical practices that are present in the ancient texts. Finally, she determines that the fundamental appeal of Revelation, especially chapters 19 through 21, is primarily its function of offering the narrative of the eschatological events which disclose God's intervention in history and in the church. Finally, she invites subsequent scholars, the rest of us, to use her work as a jumping off point in several directions. First, for studies of Revelation 19 through 21 chronologically and geographically outside the scope of her work. For example, Augustine is not included in this study, and nor are other regions of the Roman Empire. This ground is still available to be investigated. Second, for new investigations of the Latin text of Revelation, especially the so-called Western text, and local variant readings in Cyprian and Tychonius that could shed light on the original text of the New Testament. And third, drawing on an observation by Ian Boxall with us today, she points out the study's value potentially for further investigations into the textual and especially non-textual representation of Revelation in antiquity more broadly. Finally, she points out the potential of her study to those interested in exploring the broader context of Greco-Roman eschatology and related intertextual connections. Vercesi's book is exemplary in that it assiduously adheres to a very tight chronological, linguistic, and geographical scope, which provides for a compact and very coherent study. Further, within that narrow scope, Vercesi surfaces and discusses what must be very nearly all of the primary and secondary literature on the reception of Revelation in pre-Augustinian North Africa, which further contributes to its utility and therefore value to the research community. It really, I feel like for some of my subsequent research, a lot of my research is just going to be looking at footnotes in Martina's book. What emerges is a simultaneously panoramic and crisp snapshot of which authors were employing these passages of Revelation and how and why they were doing so. Certainly by the end of the book, it is beyond debate that North African Christians of the 2nd through the 4th centuries had, unlike Christians in other regions and times, especially in the Greek and the Syriac East, incorporated Revelation deeply within their theology, their literature, and perhaps more importantly, their lived experience and their memories. Unfortunately, at least to me, what it boasts in breadth and generality, it sometimes appears to lack in depth and elaboration, particularly in historical and theological development and comparison drawing. For example, a series of short synchronic investigations in a new penultimate chapter would have enabled Vercesi to draw together many of the data points that she so helpfully surfaces about recurring topics throughout the book, whether they're topical or historical or critical observations within the literature, and then craft them maybe into mini histories or mini accounts of certain theological or critical ideas or issues. The topics that kind of come up throughout the entire book are martyrdom, the millennium, the cosmic week, ecclesiology, the longing for justice. I think all of these would have benefited from a small series of 2 or 3 page accounts that kind of draws everything together into short little coherent accounts. Perhaps such connections and more synthetic text critical observations could also have been woven into the section conclusions. As it is, the fascinating and important yet scattered data points, whether topical or text critical, are often left to the reader to try to assemble on their own. Perhaps such an attempt was precluded by the word count limits imposed by UK universities where the dissertation was written. I imagine there's a lot more that could have gone into the book, but just there wasn't room. Finally, if one of the stated purposes of the volume was to surface otherwise neglected but richly developed Italian scholarship on these topics and more, one wonders whether the ambition would have been more fruitfully accomplished, especially vis-a-vis the English-speaking community, if the many and long quotations drawn from Italian and other modern sources appeared in English translation. Beyond that, I felt that the book, just in a final analysis, is extremely tight, extremely focused. It surfaces, I think, almost all of the material that is required to get into this really rich reception of Revelation 19 through 21. And I think this book is definitely going to be the go-to book for Latin reception of this part of Revelation in the years to come.
Nathan, thank you for your review. And Dr. Vercesi, you have a few minutes to respond as you wish.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Nathan, for your very nice words. I guess I'm especially grateful that you highlight a couple of points that were the aim that I had, like with the book. Like first, that it was I would not say complete, but it was like a rich overview. And for that, I have a regret, because I started with, I will go until Augustine, But then I realized it was not possible to do all the authors, including Augustine, for, like the scholarly, taking into account the scholarly literature, the text of Augustine and everything. And that's one of the big regret that I had, because I wanted to include it. But I think that on the other hand, I'm happy that there is all the text and all the quotation that I wanted to be there are in there. And you're right that I had a cap with the thesis, and you know that I, in my thesis, I also had the part on the a more deep analysis of the Latin text, which is very interesting because also with Augustine the text quite changed, and and I wanted it to include that, but I think that the my aims were reflected in what you said, and that's very important to me, because that means that like kind of my desires were taken into account when you read the book. So and so I'm grateful for your highlighted of that, and also the mention of the importance of having different sources. And that was another thing that I wanted to highlight, the fact that I wanted to be an overview of revelation in different sources. I had to cut off the iconography, because I'm not a specialist of that, and I did not want to enter in that world. But I try with, at least with the literary sources, so also taking into account martyrdom narrative, which often are excluded from interpretation accounts, and it's a pity, because that texts were also important and fundamental for Christian practices and interpretation of text. So I'm very happy for that, and and I hope to have whoever read the book and wants to write me their thoughts, that will be most welcome, because I'm very curious to know what other people think of my work. So thank you.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you, Nathan. We are holding questions for the end. We're going to do a joint Q&A session. For now, though, I'd like to transition to our next book. And this one, as I mentioned earlier, is by Nathan Betz, City of Gods, the New Jerusalem of John's Revelation in Early Christianity, published by Brill this year. And it will be reviewed by Dr. Ian Boxall. Dr. Boxall was he has taught in many places, chiefly at the University of Oxford from 1994 to 2013, where he was senior tutor and tutorial fellow in New Testament at St. Stephen's House. He then joined the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America from 2013 to 2022, and then he returned to St. Stephen's House in 2022, and recently has become the senior fellow of New Testament and also a professor of biblical studies at the Aquinas Institute of Theology in St. Louis. Dr. Boxall is very well published broadly as well. I will make note of his fabulous book, Patmos and the Reception History of the Apocalypse with Oxford University Press, which I myself have made great use of. Ian will be reviewing Nathan Betz's book, and then we'll have a response from Nathan himself. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Tom. And it's a great delight to review Nathan's book. And I should start by congratulating Nathan on writing such a long book. 474 pages, I guess not constrained by British university requirements. Now, in other circumstances, that might have been an ordeal for a book reviewer. But in fact, this book was a delight to read, elegantly written, clear, that can't be said of all scholarly monographs. And most importantly, I think why I enjoyed it, it tells an engaging story of the changing fortunes of Revelation's holy city and the constellation of ideas associated with it. in Christian sources up to the early 4th century, so effectively up to the Edict of Milan. And it's necessarily a long book for two reasons: the sheer range of authors covered and its carefully nuanced arguments. So, the sheer range of authors, not only are the usual names present: Papias, Justin, Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Origen, Tertullian, Victorinus, but others perhaps less prominent in reception historical studies of Revelation. The Shepherd of Hermas, perhaps somewhat controversially, Gregory the Wonder Worker, and the North American homily on the two mountains, Sinai and Zion. So a range of very interesting voices. And secondly, the nuance of the argument which seeks to demonstrate the complexity of early Christian thought on the millennium of Revelation 20 and the New Jerusalem of Revelation 21 to 22, and the relationship between the two of them is the result of careful analysis of the sources and the mastery of a vast body of secondary literature, bringing to bear a cluster of research questions which permeate the discussion, focused on meaning. So for the different authors, what does the New Jerusalem signify? When does it come? And where is it located? Questions of sources, both literary and oral, and influences. So, for example, can we trace threads across the early Christian map, connecting Asia, Asia Minor, to Rome, to Alexandria, to Carthage, to Pannonia? And questions about key motifs and recurring themes. So, in short, what a short review, this book is a job well done, worth 474 pages. So 474 pages, and I only have 15 minutes. In fact, I have less than 15 minutes now. So what I'm going to do is offer a very brief overview of the book, highlight what I think are some of its most significant features, and then conclude with a couple of questions. So the overview. The opening sentence of the book sets out Nathan's stall. Every great city demands a worthy account. And this city, as he goes on to explain, has, and I quote, inspired a great volume of theological reflection, ecclesial aspiration, mystical contemplation, political action, artistic imagination, and perhaps most of all, popular Christian hope. So this book is his, that is Nathan's, worthy account of John's heavenly city up to the year 313, with the introduction setting out the status Christianis and showing his indebtedness to those scholars who've laid the foundations on which he now builds. And then the main body of the book falls neatly into three parts, each with a concluding summarizing section. Part 1, the earliest reception up to around about 190, where the sources are predominantly from Asia Minor, or by authors, Justin, Irenaeus, with Asian connections, and then one outlier, the Shepherd of Hermas. Part 2 continues the journey into the 3rd century and beyond, with particular focus on Greek authors, both in Rome and in Alexandria, Clement and Origen among the latter. And then part 3 covers the same period, but from the perspective of Latin-speaking authors, mainly in North Africa, from Tertullian via Cyprian to Lactantius, as well as the earliest surviving Latin commentator, Victorinus, up in Pannonia. And here, just some of the many illuminating comments that Nathan makes in relation to part 3 is that these authors are less engaged in speculative theology or exegetical work than some of their predecessors, Victorinus accepted, and they're writing primarily for apologetic or pastoral purposes. That affects their perspective on the New Jerusalem. And they also inhabit a Christian world where Revelation's authority remained uncontested. And then there's a general conclusion that ties threads together and summarizes 6 major lines of interpretation of the New Jerusalem that Betz has identified, as well as setting out avenues for further scholarship. So, significant features. Perhaps the most significant conclusion of the book and its contribution to the reception history of the Apocalypse is its challenge to the simplistic received notion, owing much to Harnack, that an originally literal interpretation of the millennium and or the New Jerusalem associated with Papias, Justin and Irenaeus eventually gave way, not least through the influence of Origen, to an allegorical interpretation of the Holy City. Now, on reflection, of course, complexity rather than simplicity is to be expected since we're dealing with the book of Revelation, hardly the most straightforward of biblical books. And Betz is not the first to point to a more complex picture, but he has provided in this book a sustained and detailed argument to support this, namely that non-literal interpretations of the New Jerusalem can be traced back to the 2nd century. So, for example, making a strong case, which some may not be persuaded by, for knowledge of Revelation in the Shepherd of Hermas, he argues for an early spiritualizing and ecclesiological interpretation present in Rome prior to the arrival of Justin. And also that the same author can combine several different strands of interpretation. And we can see that this might be traced to the text of Revelation itself, which differentiates on a particular reading between the New Jerusalem as presently descending, Revelation 3:12, a millennial reign of the saints in Revelation 20, prior to the Last Judgment, and the final descent of the celestial city when the old heaven and the old earth have passed away, Revelation 21 and 22. And we see this time and again in the detailed discussion of authors, where he makes strong claims for this capacity to combine different kinds of interpretation, to be the case for Papias, for Melito of Sardis, and even for the New Prophecy, giving fuller weight to Tertullian's emphasis on the New Jerusalem being a heavenly city. And so his summary of the Montanist view of the New Jerusalem is as follows: it is a 3-stage reality, ecclesial in the present age, millennial in the age following Christ's return, and eternal at the consummation of all things. And then, I particularly enjoyed this, there's Betz's description of Hippolytus as a spiritualizing chiliast. One can almost hear Harnack turning in his grave. So these are just a few of the many examples that Betz provides throughout this book, always carefully grounded in close reading of primary sources and critical engagement with the scholarly debates. And his bibliography alone, 25 pages, will serve researchers on Revelation well for generations to come. Really excellent contribution. The other feature I want to highlight is the book's movement towards greater precision in some of the terminology used to describe different interpretations of Revelation and of Scripture more generally. The most obvious example is spiritual interpretation, which is widely used in the literature and indeed used throughout this book. It has a good patristic pedigree, but it can also cover a multitude, maybe not of sins, but of meanings. Does spiritual refer to any non-literal interpretation? Or specifically, at least when applied to the New Jerusalem, does it refer specifically to non-physical interpretations? Is spiritual a synonym for allegorical? Or is it a broader term, incorporating allegory and other interpretations? Are Christological and ecclesiological interpretations subcategories of the spiritual meaning? Well, it seems to me that Nathan has offered two useful definitions which aim at greater terminological precision here. First, he defines spiritual, at least as he's using it, in relation to the New Jerusalem, to mean an allegorical reading that points to a higher reality and allowing for different types of spiritual interpretations according to what that higher reality might be. So is it the church or Christ's flesh or the soul's union with the divine? And second, following Andrew Louth, he gives a very specific definition of mystical interpretation as a reading concerned specifically with mystical union with God, whether one uses the term deification or divinization or theosis. And this, by the way, explains the title of this book, City of Gods, in the plural. I was halfway through before I realized that the title was interesting, but I'm a slow reader. This picks up on what Betz has identified as a pervasive strand in early interpretation of the New Jerusalem and the particular importance of Psalm 82, verse 6. I say, you are gods, all of you sons of the Most High. An important verse for Justin and for Irenaeus and for Cyprian. So this terminological precision is a good starting point, and we might ask, are there others in the cluster of terms that are frequently used to discuss patristic interpretations of Revelation or Scripture more generally that might also benefit from greater terminological precision? I'm going to finish with a couple of questions which suggested themselves to me, and they're specifically related to how Nathan's work might be built on by others, or indeed by himself. The first is related to the history of Revelation's reception in different parts of the early Christian world, and specifically its checkered canonical status. Now, this part of the history of the New Testament canon is another area where simple explanations mark the complexity of the evidence. And as Nathan has demonstrated in relation to both Gaius of Rome and Dionysius of Alexandria, the Millennium and the New Jerusalem have often been the triggers for questioning either Revelation's authority or its apostolic authorship. So what might a fresh account of the Apocalypse's canonical fortunes look like, taking full account of the implications of this study? And the second question relates to the repeated observation throughout this book that early exegetes locate themselves firmly in the apostolic tradition, and that those who advocate for non-literal interpretations of the Millennium and or the New Jerusalem believe that this is the true meaning of the text of Revelation. So the question relates to the implications of this study, not so much for the history of patristic exegesis, but for biblical scholarship on the Apocalypse. Should we rewrite our commentaries on Revelation 20 and Revelation 21 and 22 in the light of this work on early reception? And if so, how should we do it? Specifically, what are the implications of this book for historical critical commentaries on Revelation, leaving aside those commentators who pay greater attention to the book's reception history? But in short, a work well done, well worth 474 pages.
Thank you, Ian. Let us turn our attention to Nathan.
Well, thank you very much for that review. I'm not sure I feel like it was worth 474 pages, but I'm the one who wrote it. It's very gratifying to hear that that you feel like it does some of the work that I really intended for it to do, and that is problematize, I think, some of the simple narratives that stem back to Harnack and some of the 19th century German critical scholars who were, I mean, despite their tremendous detailed work, managed to get this one pretty spectacularly wrong. I'm glad that you feel the case was made in that respect, and that a number of the other things that I labored to make sure wove into the narrative made it through in your reading, and it's very gratifying. To your questions on the history of Revelation reception and antiquity, and what would the reception of the text of the Apocalypse look like in terms of this book that I've written? Well, I think one thing that I'm actually in the process of doing right now is I think there's two different questions. There's reception of the text as the text, and then there's the reception of motifs and topoi and even liturgical expressions that are derived from or reinforced by the text of Revelation, and that live on within the church, or various strands of the Christian church in antiquity, that prove that Revelation has a fairly robust afterlife, even once the book of Revelation has been called into question, and not only called into question, like Dionysius of Alexandria calls it into question, but he says maybe it's still good if you understand it correctly. But even after that, it's even more radically kind of set to one side or chucked entirely. But what's funny is themes like the New Jerusalem just simply can't go away once they've been introduced into the kind of the intellectual bloodstream of early Christianity. The church can't seem to rid itself of some of these powerful expressions. Like, of course, they arise also in other ancient texts, but things like the Antichrist or the Millennium, or ruling and reigning with Christ. Christ is the Pantocrator, the Alpha and the Omega. Christ is, the iconography of Christ is the Lamb of God. Even Revelation comes and goes, but these images simply stick around. And I think what I'm trying to do in this book, and what I'm trying to do now, like in Syriac and in other reception, is just point to the indirect reception that's happening of the book of Revelation, even once it is kind of officially been relegated to the dustbin. It's kind of forgotten but not gone, to turn around the expression. It just lives on. So I hope that this book and some of the work that I'm doing now would invite us to think of reception not only in terms of reception of the text, but reception of the ideas within the text, because I think that's where a text really has its power, and it just continues to reverberate. Fascinatingly, then I'll wrap up, is so many of the images from Revelation are just completely shot through popular culture now, to the point where nobody even knows where they came from. But I realized that Iron Maiden's The Number of the Beast album, I don't know how many people who listened to that album knew that that was just a direct reception of Revelation. You don't need to know it's from Revelation for the image to be powerful. And so anyway, I hope that would I hope that this approach would be taken up, as indeed other people are trying to do. As to what the so-called apostolic interpretation or apostolic consciousness of interpretation of Revelation, what kind of impact that should have on the writing of modern critical commentaries or reception commentaries, I think by and large, um, we scholars always tend to be completely captivated by new things, but oftentimes returning to um, uh, older, more primitive perspectives on a text can be incredibly illuminating, and can help kind of keep the ecosystem of the exegetical ecosystem very rich, and can kind of keep us from entering into a kind of a fad-driven myopia that we all suffer from. We all suffer from just talking with people of our own time. I think this kind of critical, but nevertheless, you know, respectful reading of some of these ancient sources can, I think, give some really interesting substance to how we read these texts in the 21st century. So I think I would like to, be an advocate for those who have the great misfortune of being dead, to let them speak with a renewed voice. Doesn't mean we have to believe them; just means we have to listen to them. So anyway, thanks. Excellent questions as well.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Ian. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so I'll open it up. Please raise your hand, and I'll call on you, or just unmute yourself and fire away if nobody has. I think we have a chat. Lynn, did you want to voice that, or shall I?
I was just commenting on Nathan's thank you both for wonderful books. And I look forward to reading them both. And for the wonderful reviews. I was just responding to Nathan's reflection on the power of Revelation's images to shape the way people think and act and even construct spaces. Even apart from the texts. And I think Yijan Lin's book on immigration and apocalypse
Yeah.
captures that in a particular moment in time in sort of the modern US context or in the US context, but I think it's true elsewhere. And I appreciate having these rich descriptions that you all have, these rich collections of texts and receptions from you both. So no question, just a comment and a connection.
Thank you, Lynn. Other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Yes, please, Anne.
I'm very, very fascinated by the way that Nathan's book describes alternative meanings in Revelation. And I've often thought about how strange it is that it is the only book of the New Testament that can be interpreted in the sense of medieval allegory, that almost everything in the Old Testament can be subjected to. And that makes me wonder if part of the resistance to the apocalypse in the early church is because of that, because it's open to not literal understandings. I mean, the Gospel of Luke, what are you going to do with it? It just tells you a story, and you can say, oh, this is a foreshadowing of something else. Exegetes do that, but you can't have this program of other levels of interpretation that is from the very beginning part of the interpretation of Revelation. And I just wonder what to do with that. And I would add that a lot of my neighbors are conservative Christians, and I've had many interesting discussions with them about the Book of Revelation, because they say, well, what else could it possibly mean? Except the literal sense that it's going to happen, in the way that the Left Behind series does a very literal step-by-step. The locusts are this, the cups are this, in a modern context, because you can't think of it, according to them, in a way that it means something other than what it means literally.
Could I ask a question, Martina? Just with respect to, I think that the complexity that Anne is bringing up, if I could kind of direct some of that toward you in terms of the difficulty that Revelation presents, I never encountered any shred of resistance to the Book of Revelation in North Africa or in any of the Latin texts at all. And nevertheless, there is still this breadth of interpretation that's happening in North Africa, where you have millennialists, you have amillennialists, you have, maybe not quite anti-millennialists until you get to the late Augustine. But do you find any resistance to this malleability that Revelation seems to possess? It seems to it really makes the Greeks go crazy. But I'm just thinking in my, I can't think of any Latins that seem to have a problem with this. Do you? Like,
No,
what's your sense of
yeah,
this?
I never encounter such kind of resistance, and yeah, and you can, I mean, and one of the, I think most also interesting in the reception and the interpretation. It's also like if you see, for example, Lactantius and Commodian, like they use revelation within other literature, just like this is part of our culture, like so, and that to me seems to more like strongly say like this is what can it be like more authoritative than that, than using revelation together with the other culture that they were experiencing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Hmm. We have time for one more very quick question before we close out. And if not, I will just echo what Martina and Nathan said about the reception. In my studies, I didn't find, it was very difficult to find any kind of hesitancy in Latin tradition regarding Revelation. And what is it? Cicero said that, battles of words always tormented the little Greeks. And, you wonder if that kind of carried over into Christian culture. This has been a wonderful session. We've had wonderful panelists, wonderful books, uh, wonderful reviews. We are closing out for the holidays. So our next meeting will be February 2nd. Lynn, our very own Lynn, who's here, Lynn Huber, will be presenting a paper called Light Space, Good Space, Revelation's Throne Room as White Mythic Space. And that'll be 11 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Central European Time on February 2nd. A link will be sent out. May I wish you all wonderful holidays, and we'll see you then.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
See you on the other side.